What's up, guys? So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Knights Templar. I'm going to be talking about Notre Dame as Our Lady, and then I'm going to wrap it up with a little extra on puzzle 2-1-21. I wasn't originally going to talk about that, but because I included it in a letter to John Palancar and somebody who wasn't supposed to read it read it, I will include it just because I don't want anybody to take credit for this later on down the line when they obviously didn't. So just to start, I think it's important to note that the Knights Templar were profoundly devoted to the Virgin Mary because she was considered the spiritual mother, protector, and the quote unquote Our Lady of their order, representing a cornerstone of their religious identity. Their devotion was deeply influenced by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who championed the adoration of Mary and helped structure the Templars' rule. And there are several reasons for the devotion, which included the influence of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was somebody who helped start the Templar order. Mary as Our Lady, the Templars viewed themselves as warrior monks who owed their allegiance directly to God and Our Lady, with many vows made in her name. There was a Mother of God concept which they believed in. They believed that she offered spiritual protection and veneration for their order. She was also a symbol of divine feminine wisdom. And according to the Templar rule, it was closely modeled on the Cistercian Benedictine monastic tradition, which placed a high emphasis on devotion to the Virgin Mary. So, a lot of reasons why Our Lady, the Virgin Mary, was important to them. Now, another source states that the Knights Templar were warrior monks, and as many monks from this period of history, they were devotees of Our Lady or Lady Wisdom, the feminine counterpart of Christ. The only saints named in full in the rule of the Templars are Saint Peter, Saint Paul, and Saint Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene even has the epitaph of glorious that suggests a certain emphasis upon her as a saint, compared to the other saints who do not receive such an epitaph. And if we wanted to take a look as to where the Knights Templar were most active around the 11th to the 1300s, we could see that many Knights Templar were from the England area, Western England. Many were around the Paris region as well as many areas of France. Some were in Spain, a little bit in Portugal, and then there were a few other branches in Eastern Europe, in Germany and Italy and Hungary as well as some in Greece. So the main majority of Knights Templar were based around the Paris region. It's also important to note that even though the Knights Templars weren't known for being builders, they were heavily involved in the 12th and 13th century Gothic building boom in France, providing financial support and logistical expertise for projects like Notre Dame de Paris. Their immense independently managed wealth and construction expertise made them key contributors to the rapid, widespread expansion of new large-scale cathedrals across Europe. And we know that the Knights Templars were the first form of bankers in Europe. So it's no wonder that as they had access to a significant amount of resources and money, that they would be able to use some of that to help build cathedrals, especially since they were a very religious order. As mentioned previously, Notre Dame means Our Lady, and Notre Dame of Paris is basically the Cathedral of Our Lady of Paris. And in terms of its building construction, even though there was something built in the 4th century, which was originally called the Cathedral of Saint Etienne and dedicated to Saint Stephen, the real construction of Notre Dame began in 1163, with Bishop Maurice de Sully beginning construction for the new cathedral. And this lines up perfectly with the time of the Knights Templar, who started in 1118, and the construction went on until about 1270, and the Templar order wasn't dissolved until 1312, so this lines up perfectly with the time that the Templars were in power. And something interesting about Notre Dame is that, according to esoteric tradition and the work of the author Fulcanelli, Notre Dame of Paris features several statues and reliefs believed to represent alchemical processes. The most notable is a statue of the North Tower portraying an alchemist with a Phrygian cap, symbolizing his statue as an initiate. And then they also have other reliefs like the Ladder of Hermes, a bas relief which involves the Philosopher's Stone, alchemists, stone carvings along the North Tower, among gargoyles, and there's also an angel pointing to the left bank of the Seine, which some believe points to the location of a known alchemist laboratory. So other sources also cite the same thing about Notre Dame having alchemy in it. One such source is the Santa Monica Palisades Lodge of Freemasonry, 307 Lodge. And here it talks about how the exterior of Notre Dame is basically a book carved into the stone. And the Templars were tapped as a source of funds for construction, and a lot of the things that they wanted to include were included. It's interesting to note that Gothic cathedrals resemble the Temple of Solomon with its two pillars in the front, and in many cases, a statue of Solomon is placed to the west portal of the cathedrals and in between the towers. Now, some people believe that the Templars brought alchemy that they learned from the Sufis to Northern Europe. Sufism is something that just briefly mentioned in the Scottish Rites Freemasonry degree steps. And in Notre Dame, you could see some reliefs. This statue right here and the latter is called the Scala Philosophorum and represents the 9 alchemical steps of labor. In this picture right here, you're greeted with 12 bas reliefs located in the porch of the cathedral. The top row depicts various stages of the alchemical process, and the bottom row, the result of that process. And here's another relief which identifies with alchemy, depicting an alchemist protecting an athanor from outside forces. And alchemy and athanor is a furnace used to provide heat for alchemical digestion. It is depicted as a castle tower because that's what they look like. Now, there was a clue called the Gardengoyle on page 78, and also there was another clue, the Mira Chimera, which was on page 129. We talked real briefly about gargoyles, how there were gargoyles on Notre Dame. Well, it's also interesting to note that one of the most famous examples of gargoyles is that of Notre Dame in Paris, which dons 54 chimeras crowded around the railings of the cathedral that came to be in the 1843 restoration projects. So not only does Notre Dame have gargoyles, they also have chimera. So it does seem very plausible that this book is also talking about Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris as well. On the side of the Scottish Rites Temple in Los Angeles on Wilshire, there are two reliefs of the Cathedral of Reims. One is actually a statue of Reims, and it looks like these guys are building the cathedral at that time. And then on the side of the building, they also have a mosaic relief of the actual master masons carving and constructing statues for the cathedral at Reims. Well, if we do a deep dive into Reims Cathedral, we could see that the full name is actually the Notre Dame de Reims, Our Lady of Reims. So we have another Our Lady church. And if you look at what the front looks like, it looks just like the Notre Dame of Paris. The two look very similar, with the exception that Reims has maybe a little bit more decor in certain areas, but it's almost the same exact design. Another interesting thing about Reims Cathedral is that it has something called a church labyrinth installed in it. Now, the labyrinth in Reims was actually destroyed, I believe, by cannon fire around 1779, but this was actually a drawing of what it looked like before it was destroyed. Now, the four men on the outside were known as Master Masons, and their names were actually saved. You have Jean Orbais, Jean Leloup, Gaucho de Reims, Bernard de Soissons, and then the person in the middle is believed to be a man named Aubry de Humbert. And Aubry de Humbert was the Archbishop of Reims. He was a warrior prelate, participating in both the Albigensian Crusade and the Fifth Crusade. One thing I will say about the Albigensian Crusade was it was probably the Holocaust before the Holocaust. Basically, the French and the Pope at the time wanted to pretty much destroy an entire group of people just based on their faith, which was Catharism, and this was probably the most unjust crusade in history because it killed a lot of innocent people. But Aubry de Humbert was originally rescued by the Order of Calatrava, a group very similar to the Knights Templar, upon his return from the Fifth Crusade. And it's also interesting to note that this particular labyrinth was chosen as the national logo for French historic monuments. And you could see what the Monument Historique is in France. So very interesting about that. And if we wanted to look more into the labyrinth, it says here that unusually the names of the cathedral's successive architects succeeding each other until the completion of the cathedral's structural work are known. So it's not very common that you know these things. And the labyrinth built into the floor of the nave at the time are similar to examples of Chartres and Amiens. So it's very interesting to note that there are other labyrinths based on the one in Reims. And Chartres and Amiens are also known as Notre Dame, or Notre Dame de Chartres and Notre Dame de Amiens. So interesting to note these things. Now, did you know that there are American churches that also have labyrinths in them, and the most notable being that of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And here we are in San Francisco. If we scroll in to Grace Cathedral, they will have a labyrinth here. But what is right across the street from Grace Cathedral? Well, it's the Grand Lodge of California. So right across the street from the Grand Masonic Lodge of California, Grace Cathedral with a labyrinth in it. That's kind of interesting. Getting back to the other two cathedrals, Chartres and Amiens, there is no historical evidence that the Knights Templar directly funded these churches, even though they were there and they probably helped indirectly because they were bankers and whatnot. There are legends that suggest that the Templars might have hidden the Ark of the Covenant at Chartres, but that is just a rumor. But one thing that is interesting about Chartres is that in the north portico, the gateway is called the Gateway of the Initiates, and Templar Knights are depicted battling in the First Crusade, excavating and recovering the Ark of the Covenant, and then carrying it off towards its new resting place led by an angel with God hidden overhead in a cloud. Inscribed there, too, was a cryptic admonition in Latin, "You shall work by the Ark." The Templars, however, kept a well-defined distance between themselves and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, fast forward to modern times. I talked real briefly about a church named St. Vibiana's, or the Cathedral St. Vibiana's, which was severely damaged during the 1994 Northridge earthquake. And this is what St. Vibiana's used to look like. The exterior is still the same. And in case you're interested, Vibiana's is actually located on 2nd and Main in downtown. But the cost to fix all the damage would have cost the church between 18 and 20 million dollars. So the church actually decided to build our cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels. Our Lady meaning Notre Dame, or in Spanish, it's known as the Cathedral de Nuestra Señora de los Angeles. So Our Lady. And this church, originally thought to cost 150 million, ended up costing closer to 190 million dollars. So this is definitely a state-of-the-art church in a sense, and here it is right here next to the 101 freeway right on Temple Street. It's a very beautiful church. It is very modern, definitely not in a Gothic style at all. Very different from most churches that I've seen or I've been to, so it's a beautiful church. If you ever want to check it out, definitely do. So now I'm going to have a little fun and show you guys something that is very interesting. Earlier I showed you how to solve the first part of the 2-1, the 21, and this is the 2, and it ends right here. That point is at Los Angeles City Hall. And Los Angeles City Hall, very old building. I also told you guys that many of these buildings around downtown were built by people associated with Freemasons if they weren't Freemasons themselves. And if this area was built mainly by Freemasons, we have a church called the Cathedral of Our Lady of Angels, Notre Dame, or Nuestra Señora. It's very interesting to note that the church is actually on Grand and Temple. Grand Temple. Now, it's also interesting to note that Freemasons call their buildings Masonic temples. And then the Grand Lodge is usually their administrative office, and they usually have a Grand Lodge in some part of the state. They usually have one. The Grand Lodge of California is in San Francisco, which I just showed you was right across the street from Grace Cathedral. So very interesting to note that Grand Temple, we have Our Lady of the Angels. I also talked about earlier how one of the clues was El Capitan Theater. Well, right next to El Capitan Theater is where they filmed Jimmy Kimmel Live. But did you know that Jimmy Kimmel Live is filmed in what used to be a Freemason building? This used to be the Hollywood Freemason Temple. Well, they weren't able to pay for it, and they ended up selling it. So now Jimmy Kimmel Live is filmed at what used to be the Masonic Temple in Hollywood. Also, I've mentioned several times the Scottish Rites Temple on Wilshire Boulevard. Well, they do not even own this building anymore. The Scottish Rites Temple is now known as the Marciano Art Foundation, and this is an art museum. Now, when I talked to David, the Freemason, earlier, he actually told me that the Freemasons lost the Scottish Rites Temple because they didn't renew the lease in time. And once they didn't renew the lease in time, all the houses in the area, all the people that lived in the area, said that they didn't want them to renew the lease because there was too much noise and excess here. So this Scottish Rites Masonic Temple is now an art museum. And the Marciano Art Foundation is actually owned by the founders of Guess Inc., the clothing brand. So there is no Masonic temple and there is no Scottish Rites temple in Southern California. There are just buildings, but they no longer own any grand buildings anymore. But it is interesting to note that on Grand Temple, there is an Our Lady of the Angels. Also, one final thing about the Church of Our Lady of Angels. In the crypt at the bottom of the church, we have a Jerusalem cross on the bottom of the church. And the Jerusalem cross is also known as the fivefold cross or the cross and crosslets and the Crusaders' cross. It was first used as the coat of arms of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem after 1099, and use of the Jerusalem cross by the Order of the Holy Sepulchre and affiliated organizations in Jerusalem continued to the present. And on the website templarcross.com, it says the Jerusalem cross is undeniably a very important symbol of the Middle Ages and still today. Throughout the ages, different variants have been used by a number of people and organizations. Its weight during the Crusades was far from negligible, and the cross still serves today as an emblem of certain branches of Christianity. Its meaning, too, has undergone multiple evolution, and even today, several interpretations are acceptable. Whatever point of view we adopt, the Cross of Jerusalem remains and will always remain a powerful symbol of Christ and the Christian religion. As such, it has earned its place among the most important Christian crosses of all time. So once again, it's pretty interesting to find a Jerusalem cross at the bottom of this cathedral. The Jerusalem cross is associated with the Crusades, and the Crusades are definitely connected with the Knights Templar. So just another interesting fact. And now I'm going to tell you one more secret, which is really fun. So at the end of this too, it'll take us to the LA City Hall. And there is actually a secret way that you can take from the LA City Hall. I'm not going to tell you what the secret way is. If you're intelligent and you're smart, you'll figure it out on your own. But it will take you to a place in the corner, and it's called the Da Vinci Apartments. We spoke about Leonardo da Vinci previously as a possible member of the Priory of Sion, and we've seen that some of his pictures were the basis of some of John Palancar's pictures. And it is interesting to note that right in the middle of the little driving area, there is an obelisk. And we've seen obelisks before, haven't we? Very interesting. And right above it, we have two freeways, the 110 and the 101, the Hollywood Freeway and the Harbor Freeway. And this is actually called the Stack 4-level interchange. And a little bit of background about it is that it is the first stack interchange in the world. So this is where two freeways overlap and then they uh, can merge onto each other. So it is the oldest stack interchange in the world, and it's right here in Los Angeles. But let me ask you guys, do you guys see anything interesting about this pattern or design? Well, if you don't, I'm going to show you. So let me ask you guys, if I color this in right here, does this look like anything that we've seen before or talked about? And if you don't know, how about now? Does this kind of remind you of what a Templar cross looks like? So kind of interesting that we would have something that appears to be a Templar cross, the oldest four-stack interchange in the world, in Los Angeles by the Da Vinci Apartments in an area known to be associated with Freemasons. Very interesting. And also, I talked real briefly during the talk about the Templars in Acre that they were always next to the harbor, and when the Knights Templar had to leave during Black Friday, when the Templar Order was dissolved, they had to flee to La Rochelle, which was a harbor, to escape. Now, this Templar cross is right on or in the 110 freeway, which is also known as the Harbor Freeway. The Harbor Freeway. And of course, the 110 will take you to the harbor eventually down in San Pedro. But interesting to note, the Harbor Freeway, Knights Templar escape route, right in the middle of downtown. Well, that's interesting enough. But how about New York? So here we are in New York, and as you can see from the New York 2-1, the one side, the end of the clues would take you to Broadway. And right in Broadway, there is a statue of a man named Father Francis P. Duffy. And you could see that it's basically a Celtic cross. And we've seen a Celtic cross before in San Francisco. And the cross was in commemoration of Sir Francis Drake kind of coming to San Francisco in the New Albion area. So again, in Broadway, right in Father Duffy Square, we have a Celtic cross. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do it like I didn't tell you in the last one, but there is a way that if you go from this area of Broadway, it will actually take you to the New York Public Library. And it's not the New York Public Library that we're interested in so much as the park right behind it, which is called Bryant Park. And if you took a look at Bryant Park, it might be difficult to see what you would be looking for. But if I superimposed a picture on top of Bryant Park and I rotated it slightly, you would see here on the right side the front of Solomon's Temple. And it kind of is divided into certain areas with two pillars. And these two branches right here being the pillars. You have stairs, you have the front door, and sometimes they have decorative designs. It just depends on which picture of Solomon's Temple you're looking at. But this would be Solomon's Temple, which is pretty crazy because on all accounts, this is just a park, right? Now, it's also interesting to note that the builders of the New York Public Library were a firm called Carrere and Hastings. And Carrere and Hastings also worked on something we might be familiar with, the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine, Florida, which is now known as Flagler College. So interesting that they were down in St. Augustine as well. Also in the clue, typographical terrors, they also talked about Gutenberg. Well, one of the rare books that is owned by the New York Public Library is a copy of a Gutenberg Bible, one of the oldest printed Bibles in the world. So interesting to note those things as well. So there you have it, guys. In 21, you have a Templar cross in Los Angeles, and you have the Temple of Solomon in New York at Bryant's Park, right next to the New York Public Library. I'm sure you're asking yourself, what does it all mean? Were the people who built it Templars, Freemasons, for the Priory of Sion? Well, I'm going to leave that up to you to figure out. But all I could tell you is that there is a Templar cross in the freeway and there is a Temple of Solomon in the park. That is 21. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I will talk to you next time.